Today, we are very fortunate to welcome Ronald Dahl, who is director of the Institute of Human Development at the University of California, Berkeley, where he also serves as a professor in the School of Public Health and the Joint Medical Program and runs the Adolescent Research Collaborative. He's the founding director of the Center for the Developing Adolescent, where he provides the strategic vision for the center's research agenda. He is a pediatrician and developmental scientist with longstanding research interests in the development of sleep, arousal and regulation, affect regulation, and the development of behavioral and emotional disorders in children and adolescents. Dr. Dahl has been elected as a fellow to numerous organizations, including the Association for Psychological Science, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the New York Academy of Sciences, and the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. He's also the founding editor of the journal Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience and past president of the Society for Research in Child Development. So if you could all silence your phones and join me in welcoming Dr. Dahl.
Thank you so much. It's really a joy to be here among some old friends and some new friends and colleagues, and to share some ideas. And in this context of an intellectual community, really thinking about large impact ideas and how these can be translated into policy and impact. And those are really the issues I care about a lot. And I'm going to be talking about a set of ideas that have really been at the center of certainly what I've been thinking about, but also in a set of collaborations I've been involved in with a few different groups of people I'll talk about a bit. And it's very much, even though I'm going to take all the blame for the ideas in terms of their the rough edges, it's all such a product of interdisciplinary teams over a long periods of time of informing each other's work. And I'm going to give a bit of an ambitious talk, and ambitious in the sense of I'm going to cover several small areas of research or of understanding and try to bring them together at the end. And so I'm going to go a little bit fast, but I'm going to give a very brief, overly simplistic summary at the beginning, kind of give you the punchline at the end that we're going to get to. And then I will back out and give the backstory related to those individual components. So the first point that is really at the center of this work is a focus, a developmental science focus and perspective, and I'll explain what I'm talking about in terms of developmental science perspective, on the transition from childhood into adolescence. And I'm going to intentionally define that in a vague sense at the beginning, and how we're increasingly understanding this transition as a precarious, that's the imagery. It's a time that things can tip in a lot of different directions and creates in many ways an inflection point in the developmental trajectory, not only for behavioral health and social competence and a number of other things we care about deeply, but I think actually in the human life force. And I will unpack that a bit. But that's really a central point that is just relevant not only to the framing, but I think really some of the central insights from this work. And then this is a very complex slide. And again, I will unpack these ideas more carefully as we go. But to summarize it briefly, is that this is focusing on this construct of mattering, which I'll define, as something that becomes more important, more salient, and more influencing of learning and behavior as young people are moving from childhood with pubertal maturation into adolescence. And this is related to social value, of feeling valued by others, having social value, and the incentive salience or motivational salience, which I'll talk about what we mean by that term, by that scientific term, increases as puberty starts. And that creates sensitivity to social evaluation. We're very sensitive at all parts of the lifespan to what other people think of us, but that turns up in amplitude as young people are moving into adolescence. And it increases the wanting to be liked, admired, and respected, and a stronger aversion to being embarrassed, humiliated, or disrespected. We all have strong likes and dislikes in those categories throughout the lifespan, but these intensify in this window of development, and that this creates a window of opportunity. creates an opportunity for foundational learning, social learning, formative learning, particularly with respect to pro-social learning, doing things for the benefit of others. And this capacity to have formative learning about caring for and about others and contributing in meaningful ways and in rewarding ways to society and community creates unique opportunities for impact and potentially a pivotal time to be targeting to improve developmental trajectories that has a great deal of relevance from a global perspective. So that's the summary. So now let me go back. And I also want to mention that we just recently submitted a paper. Actually, Emma Armstrong Carter, who's in the audience, who's at Tufts, faculty member at Tufts University, Wouter Vandenbos, who's a faculty member at the University of Amsterdam, and I have been really formulating a more specific model about how these changes in wanting to matter and changes in learning to care for and about other people together create these opportunities. And we just submitted this paper for review in developmental cognitive neuroscience on wanting to matter, learning to care, a neurodevelopmental window of opportunity for pro-social learning. And several of the ideas that I'm going to be presenting are also covered in more detail in that paper, which we hope will be accepted and be able to share soon. So this is a map of where we're going. And this is just to keep us oriented as I move a little too fast over a lot of material, the apology in advance. So the first box in blue is I'm going to talk about what I mean, at least, by a developmental science perspective, approaching this really key window and focus on what has driven so much research and so much interest in policy that this is a time of vulnerabilities, emerging social and emotional challenges that cascade into problems, all kinds of problems, and the mental health crises that more and more people are identifying as concerning, not just in wealthy countries, but around the world. And that's the first set of points. And then the second set of things that we'll cover is the mirror image of that. The same set of changes, the same set of rapid interacting feedback loops in learning create a window of opportunity. And we tend to focus more on the risks and the negative cascades, but I think there's emerging strong evidence that we should see this as, particularly early adolescence, as a window of opportunity for social and emotional learning and development of social competence. And then the third box is going to be explaining this construct of mattering, what we mean by that, to feel socially recognized, appreciated, and capable of actions that benefit others as a fundamental motivation in human development. And it's important, I think, across human development, but it becomes particularly important in early adolescence. And then we'll talk a bit about new capacities, motives, and opportunities for learning to care for and about others. Even though prosocial behaviors tend to go down in adolescence, the capacity to learn and engage in prosocial behaviors, I think, is actually goes up. And we'll talk about that. And then finally, in a related set of new capacities, motives, and opportunities for learning for prosocial is about contribution to community, contribution outside the family, to making a larger impact, and to feel like you matter by doing things that matter to others through caring and contribution is part of this positive feedback loop. And then at the end, after I cover these 5 topics, I'll try to bring it together and talk a bit about the global perspective and policy implications. So that's where we're going. That's the map. I just want to add one other thing, which is that there's a really key set of issues around feelings and affective signals related to feelings that are crucial. And so what I'm going to do, it'll be a fun experiment, I'm going to actually, as a break between each box, I'm going to have some guess the motive case games to just be able to illustrate some points. And this idea, in brief, is that we really need to think about feelings not just as this vague term of broad categories of experience that get used in many ways, but as neural signals that are conveying quick summaries of really complex information, and that they communicate important information in a number of ways. They communicate social information. They also communicate to ourselves aspects about our emotional state and communicate that information to others. but they also communicate information, complex information about internal states. Our sodium water balance gets communicated as thirst, hunger, sleepiness. And the really key issue here, or the main points that I want to make, is that motives and motivations are often represented in feelings. And so just like we have a motive to seek water when we're thirsty and to seek safety when we're afraid, or to find sleep when we have a high sleep drive, there are a number of social motivational feelings that are going to influence our behavior and motivations in similar ways. And we don't tend to think about motivational feelings that way. And so again, in order to sort of illustrate this in a more fun way, I'm going to give a couple examples. There's no guessing what emotions are in that picture, what emotions are being experienced by each individual, what emotions are being conveyed by each individual, and what emotional experience is being shared by those two individuals. So integrative developmental science. I think a lot of people here are, work in developmental science. But the way that I want to emphasize what I'm going to refer to as integrative developmental science, that we're very interested in developmental neuroscience. It's a passion of mine, and I have to rely on colleagues who have a lot of expertise beyond what I have and our group has directly. But equally important, if not more important, is the developmental psychology, work in education, the science of learning, public health, and the social, clinical, and implementation sciences, and how these insights from these different levels of integrative developmental science can really inform policy. Now, I want to illustrate this concept and what I think the implications of developmental science are with a really, really simple example. And it may seem a little bit of a tangent, but I think it helps make some key points that become more important when we talk about social and motivational learning. And that is, these key ideas about developmental continuities and discontinuities is at the heart of a developmental science perspective, and trying to understand underlying developmental processes, mechanistic insights into these processes that can inform the trajectories of these processes that give us insights into windows of vulnerability, windows of opportunity, and policy implications. So let me illustrate that with something really, really simple. These are just pediatric growth velocity curves. These are boys, girls going from birth to age 19 in boys and girls. This is not height. This is how many centimeters per year an individual kid has grown in that in the interval between measurements. And what you can see is that growth velocity in infants is super high. They grow really, really fast, but they are slowing down their rate of growth. They gradually slow down, kind of plateau between ages 5 to 10 or 11. But they're still growing 6 centimeters a year. I mean, they're growing. There's continuous growth. But I think we can see really clearly this is a discontinuity. Suddenly, the growth rate is shooting up at a really intense acceleration, and then it reverses really quickly, and then the growth rate declines sharply until we stop growing. And this is the same thing in girls, except it's starting about a year and a half earlier, is a little bit wider and comes down a little bit earlier. But of course, the underlying process here is not being 10 or 11 or 12. It's not being a certain grade in school or eating certain things or being in an environment. This is puberty. This is the pubertal growth spurt. And if you happen to go through puberty 2 years earlier, this is going to happen earlier. And if you go through late, or if you don't have puberty, this is a specific process. And that leads to some really interesting windows of vulnerability. We have great data. I shouldn't call it great. We have very compelling data that if you happen to be in a famine or a war or a conflict area where there's insufficient food, being an infant or being in a pubertal growth spurt will make you stunted. We have historical data from many studies. You are more vulnerable because you're growing fast. But of course, if you reverse that, that means that if you are trying to supplement, you're going to have a bigger impact of opportunity because you're addressing a more urgent need. And this is a model for really important insights from developmental science. This is very simple for height. And in fact, it's not simply that it's getting enough calories when you're growing fast. How much calcium and phosphorus you get and how much exercise you get in this part of the curve right here in the pubertal growth spurt in females will influence your risk for osteoporosis when you're old, because you're storing calcium and phosphorus between the stress on your muscles and bones, and that's going to affect osteoporosis in old age. So this idea of investing in windows of opportunity, which are overlapping almost by definition with windows of vulnerability in many ways, is so simple when we understand the underlying process and mechanistic insights and the implications. But of course, puberty is not just growing fast. Puberty involves a huge suite of changes. It is a period of rapid physical growth, transformative changes in sexual maturation, sex-specific changes in facial structure, voice, body characteristics, changes in sleep and circadian regulation, changes in metabolic changes because you're growing twice as fast, a wide array of cognitive, emotional changes. There are changes in gene expression, and of course, changes in social motivations, which we'll talk about, social context and social roles. And at every level, biological, neurodevelopmental, behavioral, there are bidirectional interactions. As you shift your motivations, your behavior, and who you interact with, what kinds of experiences you have, as you interact with culture and society, those are going to influence your behavior, which are going to influence your brain. And so the bidirectional interactions is why I have an image like this. Oh, and then of course, figuring out how to relate to the world and yourself as a suddenly and mystifyingly sexual being, and of course, adapting to a rapidly changing and increasingly technological world. This is a lot of levels of interactive change. And this is why for 20 or 30 years, there's a huge amount of investment from NIH and many other funding institutions about the problems of what is often called the health paradox of adolescence. Because on one hand, adolescence is the healthiest period of the lifespan. Almost everything you can measure gets better. You get stronger, smarter, better reaction time, more resilience to stress, injury. You're well before any declines of adulthood. And yet, what does overall morbidity and mortality do? It goes up 200 to 300%. Why? Because of morbidity and mortality related to behavior and emotion. Increasing rates of accidents, suicide, alcohol and substance use, violence, reckless behaviors, eating disorders, risky behaviors, obesity gets worse and it's much harder to treat. And so this paradox has led a lot of people to say, actually, let me just go back for 1 second. A huge amount of the interest is all problem focused. How do we diminish or decrease the rates of problems? And these are really important issues. But I want to now move from a clinical or policy or even epidemiological perspective and take our developmental science perspective, just like we did with height. Okay. And now I'm going to just show you, I could show you 20 slides, but I'm just going to show you a few. Okay, it tried to show 20. This is self-injurious behavior. This is measures of cutting behavior. I've actually forgotten which year this is, but what I want to point out is this is age, 10 here and 80 here. If you are thinking about this as a clinician, you say, oh, we need to really think about 15 to 20-year-olds, or even up to 45. That this is really when this problem is at its peak and most concerning. But if you're a developmental scientist, are you much more interested in this? I mean, from 0 to the highest level of the lifespan in this tiny interval between 10 and 14. What about harming others? The old age crime curves, okay? Some of the worst things that human beings do. Again, these are problems of what? Late teenage and early adults. That's when the peaks and they decline. But what about this? Going from very, very low rates to the highest rates, the same window from 10 to 14. How about alcohol and drug abuse? 10 to 15. And I could show you depression rates. And there are many different kinds of behavioral and emotional problems. They're not all exactly the same in terms of the details, but the inflection point is very often starting in the same, and it's not turning 10. It's not hitting a certain age. So this has led to this idea of early adolescence as an inflection point, as this the development for negative trajectories of behavioral, emotional, and mental health, shaping habits, patterns, behavior, mindsets, and social identities that have long-term impact, not just on health, but education, economic, and social success. And so this has been part of the source of this focus of trying to understand the underlying processes and opportunities to change these trajectories. But now we'll do the first guess the motive case. Okay, this is a high-stakes decision before eating one's own brain. This happens to be sea squirts, or our tourniquets, is a species that has been incredibly successful for more than 500 million years, evolved in the early Cambrian period. Talk about successful species. We'll be lucky to make it another 100 years, and then we'll have 10,000 well, we won't even go there for at the moment. But the main point I want to make is the adult form of these animals is as filter feeders that are fixed to the bottom of the ocean, and they just sit there and filter nutrients out of the water. But they have a juvenile form, and their juvenile form looks like a primitive version of vertebrates. They have a notochord, they have brain, they have an eye, they have a balance organ, and they swim around, and they make one decision in their life, okay? Which is where to put their tail and undergo metamorphosis, absorb their brain, their eye, their balance organ. They don't need it anymore. They're absorbing it. They're done. They've made one decision. And they've been successful doing this for 500 million years. So here's the question. How do they decide? Okay. Are they making a decision? Or is it random? Like, okay, let's just spread around the ocean and move around. And by chance alone, some of them will be successful. What do you think? Guesses for it's mostly random? Or they actually process information and make decisions? I see a little more movement on the side. Yeah. So it turns out they do really interesting, behaviorally relevant, preference-based information processing. Light and dark, temperature, concentration of minerals, they'll even avoid levels of bacteria. How are they making a decision? They have evolved motives over hundreds of millions of years at the species level to be drawn toward or away from cues. That is a really interesting algorithm. They're not thinking, they're adjusting behavior with feedback that is a primitive version. We don't call them they have feelings, but it is a feedback system that's adjusting by motives that were shaped by their particular evolution. And actually, there's different subspecies of tardigrades that do this differently. But we'll come back to this theme a little bit later. So now we're here, the second box. We're going to switch to the opportunity frame. And I want to say that for everything we talked about as a negative cascade, there are similar positive trajectory sequences. This early adolescence is an incredibly interesting time of learning, exploration, acquiring knowledge and skills, shaping intrinsic motivations and values and attitudes. We'll talk a bit about heartfelt goals. And it's a time when as we get changes in these social and affective neural systems and interacting with goals, they're shaping each other. So goals are, and the particularly prioritized goals that we have are being influenced by our strong feelings. And this is a formative time for learning. Now, this is the broad overview, we've been using for a long period of time. That it's important to remember that learning and brain development are inextricably intertwined. I mean, everything we learn, there's neural correlates, and as the biological maturation and the learning change our brains, that changes how we learn in certain ways. And I have, as a clinician, it seemed to me really early on that it's much easier to focus on this level of input than trying to change this. Going in and changing the brain with medications or brain stimulation is when you can actually do it this way. It seems like we want insights about the brain development and windows of plasticity and windows of sensitive learning. But I think the most important implication of this work is how to create the right kind of learning, and particularly in this window of time. We, and now I'm saying we in the broadest sense, many teams of people who've been working in this area for at least 15 or 20 years have been trying to summarize what else happens in puberty in terms of social and affective changes. Some of this has come from behavioral work, even much earlier than the neuroscience. And basically, there's some themes. There's an increase in sensation seeking, liking intense novel experiences. The capacity to experience fear as a thrill as a part of this is an interesting part. Increased interest and engagement in social learning, promotes risk-taking in pro-social as well as dangerous ways. Increase in attention and incentive salience for gaining or losing admiration, respect, acceptance, belonging, and status. I'm lumping them together now. We're going to come back and take this apart. And these experiences create intense feelings. One of the things, if you spend any time in a middle school classroom or with a bunch of 6th or 7th graders, is just the emotional volume and volatility. It's like anchovies. You either love it or you hate it, or it's an acquired taste, because most people, it's just really dissonant. But those dynamics are part of the learning, and I'll come back to that a bit later. But what's really key in this volatile period of these changing social and affective experiences are the social and cultural contexts that are conveying status and prestige criteria that then are going to shape some aspects of learning about self, other, and emotionally charged relationships. And in particular, I'm going to unpack this a bit: relational learning, not just relationship formation, friendships, and exploring different aspects of more mature relationships, but a relational nature to caring about ideas, causes, can have a relational aspect to it. So as we've moved into more of the neuroscience and developmental social neuroscience, a few more levels of understanding have emerged. And I just want to, again, briefly summarize some really complex issues, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but there's some major themes. And I think one is that as we try to put together some of the evidence about what's changing as kids are moving into adolescence, it's that there's increased attentional and motivational salience for gaining social acceptance and respect and autonomy and agency. Let me just take a moment with this autonomy and agency piece. There's clearly a desire for autonomy and being agentic, but a couple of my colleagues have really convinced me that most of what we call autonomy seeking in adolescence is autonomy from people trying to control us. We don't want autonomy from our friends or from people that we're engaging with. And if you think of autonomy as autonomy from control, that's agency. And so we're just gonna call it agency as we move forward with this model, and the sensitivity to social hierarchies, status, popularity. A lot of evidence that this is what becomes more salient. It gets processed faster. It gets processed with more urgency, and it's driving learning. And this valuing. This is a really interesting study that I was involved in. Stephanie Cardus was a grad student that led this study. Actually, Wouter Vandenbos was part of this study. It was a very clever task that basically had a bidding component where you could quickly maximize your bidding strategy to get the most money, guessing how much money was in the suitcase and then seeing the money. But if you thought you were playing with other people, you could also overbid and win more of the auctions, but you lose money because you're the only one that knows how much was really there. And Wouter modeled this. It was really clear that the 11 to 13-year-old girls who had some elevation in testosterone and were starting into puberty would value reputational effect. They would overbid to get more wins rather than maximize their money. And so it's just the simplest evidence that as puberty is kicking in, both are reinforcers. Money and popularity are both valuable. And so a social reinforcement learning model, of course, both of those reward. But what's happening is the gain, the relevance of reputation is going up as puberty is starting. And there's lots of evidence from social psychology, developmental psychology that fit this. And a really elegant study looking at priorities of in early adolescence of peer status gains over deep social and academic goals, but also proclivities for social connection and mattering to others. This increase in social motivations in relational ways that we're going to come back to. So again, adolescents show greater activation compared to adults now, not just following them forward. When viewing images of peers and social rewards, the salience of social feedback, either loss or gain, and wanting and seeking respect, admiration, positive social value feedback, and avoiding the negative things. So what we have been thinking a lot about, and I will talk about some more when we talk about the construct of mattering, is that adolescence is a very, very broad period of time, particularly in contemporary society, as puberty has been happening earlier and becoming an adult is moving really late. For many, we laugh, especially those of us with adult kids. When we say when is someone an adult, it's like when they're financially independent, I think is what. And how the percentage of adults living at home is striking. But the point is that adulthood is really a social role definition, and the beginning of adolescence is biological maturation, which has been happening earlier. This is a very, very long period of time. This is the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine report on adolescent development. But what I like about this graph is how they've done a color coding, because we can't generalize about 10 to 25-year-olds. Those are very, very different. We're particularly interested in this blue and bluish green period right here, early adolescence, as these gonadal hormones are going up, as these dramatic changes and the growth spurt are occurring. Not that we're interested in the whole trajectory. There's so many important things to support young people in middle adolescence and the transition to adulthood. There's tremendously important work in this area. But I think from the biology and learning sensitivity, this is the window that we think there's a lot of evidence is formative in this period of time. So, case number 2, what made her do it? Okay. This is a real picture. This was a local newspaper about a year ago, and this raccoon chewed through layer shingles, metal flashings displaced, and through a wooden room. Why? What would motivate this poor raccoon to do this? What? Whoops. Whoa, I'm sorry. Why did we? Oh. Yeah. Yes. That's what it is. That's milk. Two things to point out. One is, no one's going to accuse us of anthropomorphizing if we say this is a fierce feeling of motivation. I mean, the idea that this is a motivational feeling that an animal would exert such extreme behavior. And second, most interesting thing is the emotion in this room. And you hear it in my voice. We immediately care about this raccoon. We care. They got the kids out, right? I mean, instantly we cared, or most of us. And so it's this idea of feelings, the power of feelings to evoke complex systems and to appreciate this idea that often this high intensity motivational behavior is connected to what we will call, in some sense, these feeling-based systems, which we'll come back to for humans. So now we're getting to mattering, the wanting to matter. And it's been a really interesting journey to think about this psychological construct of mattering and review the literature and parse it and operationalize it. And I'm going to go over this a bit, quickly. We can come back and dive more deeply if people are interested. So this wanting to matter, this is really the incentive salience, really wanting something. There's a lot of neuroscience work about the difference between wanting and liking. And this is really advanced neuroscience of addiction. For example, people can want something they no longer like. There are different reward systems. This is really about a wanting system that is appearing to be amplified as puberty occurs. And it's wanting not only to gain social value, but also personal agency. And these both go up as puberty starts. And we really are believing in it, and we go into this in the paper that we just submitted, that this is a really useful heuristic for understanding an amplified motive that includes both aspects of that of this increased salience. Wanting to feel that one matters, and crucial aspects of this learning are working through affective feeling-based processes. And if you look at how they're measured, they're primarily measured by having people report how they feel about mattering to others. And this is an amplified motive that can gradually influence action outcome learning as young adolescents are exploring and learning how to navigate increasingly complex social and relational environments. And, I need to put it down. I'm not trying to advance. So there's a long literature on mattering as a psychological construct. Rosenberg actually first started looking into this more than 30 years ago as an aspect of self-esteem, being significant to others. But there's a couple and a number of studies have. Let me just make sure I didn't skip a slide. Here we go. Starting with Rosenberg and colleagues in 1980, looking at self-esteem to include aspects of self-concept shaped by feeling significant to others. Schlossenberg and colleagues really focused on feeling appreciated. And over the ensuing decades, lots of studies that show that mattering predicts well-being, self-esteem, and positive affect, and that not mattering is associated with depression and anxiety. And then these two, looking at the literature really carefully, there's like two cardinal features that we want to emphasize relevant to the heuristic we think is particularly important in adolescence. And the first part is that it's fundamentally affective. It's been assessed primarily in terms of a subjective sense of mattering to others, and it becomes relevant to an affective appraisal, a fast appraisal, feeling-based appraisal about self as having social value, and that feeling socially valued is often related to your actions. You don't want to just be appreciated. You want it to be related to things you actually did. And in fact, one of the studies, Reese, was that really looked at the two factors in their measure of mattering, is one was clearly related to feeling recognized and appreciated, and the other was whether it had anything to do with your feedback. And anyone who's ever worked in an organization that says, oh, we really appreciate you, but has nothing to do with anything you did, you kind of know how that feels, right? And so action-based mattering is a component, and the two are related to a general feeling, not only that you matter, but your actions are making some impact. And so this is the cartoon version of these constructs, a sort of an appreciation feeling, like what are the learning experiences that form an appraisal that we matter, that we have self-worth, not that we think about or reflect on, but really this feeling. And similarly, an affective appraisal about the impact of our actions and efforts and how to gain. Like if we have an increased incentive salience, an increased appetite in effect for social value and action-based mattering, how do we gain those? How do we gain more of what we have this appetite or motivation for? And so this leads to kind of an interesting model about how these changes in biological maturation, just like the processes that underpin the pubertal growth spurt, there are biological changes that increase sensitivity to social value feedback and social learning processes through our actions, action outcome or reinforcement learning models that are feeding back into what we believe in this heuristic is wanting to matter, and that this creates a window of opportunity for formative pro-social learning. And that is, if you get positive feedback that you're feeling appreciated and your actions are mattering to others in beneficial ways, that really creates an opportunity and a potentially pivotal window of learning. And how can this provide actionable insights at the level of interventions and implications for policy is really a major part of the rest of the talk that I want to do today. I want to illustrate one example. This did not grow out of the mattering work, but this was work going on in parallel. So David Yeager, Harold Dweck, and I were talking about the development of motivations, and David had just done reviews of school-based behavioral health programs, and showing that most of these really well-designed school-based behavioral health programs stopped working in middle school. They stopped working in adolescence, and sometimes they started backfiring. We started getting negative effects. He was really interested in this, and so one of the theories that emerged is by what was then an historical reflection on the Truth Campaign for Anti-Smoking. I don't know how many people are old enough to remember that, but it was fascinating when the evidence finally forced the tobacco companies to put warning labels on cigarettes. They realized, not by research, but through marketing, that they could do it in ways that made kids more likely to smoke. And most of the efforts for public health were backfiring because the idea, going again, and David is a key person in this, is that he was focusing on the fact that as young people, especially young people, well, let me just keep it simple. As young people are moving into this phase, their desire to be respected is so sensitive that even subtle cues of being disrespected are really aversive. And when you tell someone, you should do this, you shouldn't do that because it's going to be better for you later in your life, it's kind of condescending. It's like, you don't know what's good for you. Oh, adults and these teachers are the whatnot. And so part of this, and there's some evidence for this, and we'll get to it in a minute. But the idea is that this sensitivity to status and respect can actually undermine really well-designed behavioral interventions because they actually are kind of diminishing by implying that young people don't even know how to make their own decisions and they're going to get a pushback. And so we wrote this paper. It was actually a really fun paper, and we got a lot of, we laid out some different predictions in this model. But in parallel, David was working with Chris Bryan to say, okay, let's try it. Let's design a study. Let's take healthy eating and see if this works. And they did such a great job with the study. They used real quotes from big sugar and junk food marketing that say, I wouldn't give that to my kids. And they would take the message. It was this two versions of the same intervention, but one was a values aligned messaging frame, which was rather than saying, you should do this, you should that, which then leads to kids saying healthy eaters are lame nerds who do what parents, teachers, and other adults tell them. You switch it to healthy eaters are independent-minded people who stand up to the junk food industry and make the world a better place. And it's part of social justice. What we shouldn't let people profit by getting kids hooked on really unnutritious foods. And they did a pre-registered, longitudinal, randomized, controlled field experiment and showed this framing made it effective. And they looked at real food purchases with the certificates they got for participating in the cafeteria. And the effects were sustained for at least 3 months. They have a couple years of follow-up now. And it was just a wonderful proof of concept that something as subtle as the messaging that honored their ability to do something positive versus tell them what to do made this effective. Brian Gala and colleagues at Pittsburgh designed a very similar study looking at how the same kind of value-aligned messaging could get adolescent motivation to control social media use. Again, found support for this. But these are examples, particularly focusing on the sensitivity for respect, but they demonstrate how a relatively nuanced affective construct, insights into the sensitivity of feeling respected or value, can translate into pragmatic progress in a behavioral intervention. Okay, case 3. Scott Frank has a very lucrative side gig. Okay, so I don't know how many of you read The New Yorker. This is an amazing profile. So Scott Frank commands a fee that he acknowledges is insane, $300,000 a week. Okay, and most of his jobs last a few weeks. So the question, what does he do? Unless you've read it, what does he do? There are lots of people out there willing to pay him $1 million for a few weeks of sleep. Any guesses? He's a script doctor who diagnoses and fixes movie scripts. And he's really, really good at it. And this profile, it's actually quite interesting to read, but it's 2 really important points relevant to our story today. The first quote, and again, really great profile, it goes into depth and nuance on a number of things. But one of the things that is really key to his abilities is that he can, and he obsesses, he reads the script, he thinks of the structure, and what he does is how do you get people, viewers, to care about the characters really quickly? And lots of writers know that. If you don't care about the characters, it's hard to engage them. But the second quote is I find particularly interesting, and in this interview, this really comes out. He says, studio executives, like, they want to get to the action. They want to get quickly into the story. And he said the audience never become attached enough to the characters to be concerned about their fates. But here's a wonderful quote that I really want to focus on for a few minutes. He says, at the end of the movie, Viewers understand how they're supposed to feel, but they don't feel it. Now, that sounds like a really subtle, nuanced difference, right? But it's not. It's the difference between hearing a clever joke and saying, that's funny, or laughing uproariously. Those are night and day. And that feeling that evoked the uproarious laughter is happening before you've even processed why the joke is funny. Feelings activate these fast, complex systems, including caring about the character. Any of you binge watch during the pandemic Queen's Gambit? Go back and watch the two opening scenes. And it's really powerful. There's a deeper issue here, which is how certain kinds of experiences evoke strong feelings of caring that would carry us through a movie, carry us through a book, carry us through a Netflix series, and we care about the character and what happens to them. It's a really remarkable capacity. So, learning to care. I think that one of the things that's fascinating about our model, and we talk about this in the paper, is that if you think of this as a pivotal time of social learning, again, this isn't learning and taking in information, remembering it, and repeating. This is learning like you learn a skill or a sport. It's really action outcome learning and through trial and error and experience. And there's sort of three different paths. We're oversimplifying. Nothing's ever simply into three paths, but there's three important paths that we think can emerge from this period of time. One is if you have pro-social learning experiences that give you positive feedback in these ways, that has a really strong positive feedback loop because you're mattering by doing things that matter to others through pro-social actions. And so it is really feeding this, it's providing positive feedback, not just as a reinforcer or a reward, but into these sensitized motivational systems about agency and about social value, but in the form of benefiting others. And I think there's some really interesting reasons why that may have been a most important kind of learning for most of human history to obtain, finding ways to contribute to those you care about. And of course, a huge concern in the world right now is how many young people feel like they don't matter, that their actions don't matter, that the world is so screwed up that there's nothing they can do, whether it's climate change or social justice or their actions. And it's true that part of that is thoughts, feelings, a narrative, but feeling like your actions don't matter at this deep affective appraisal is almost the equation of learned helplessness. It's this internal state. Why put out effort and action if it's having no effect? Not that you think that in words. And so that is one huge concern. But of course, the other thing is if you're not getting any action and outcome, making any difference with pro-social behaviors, there's lots of ways to mess with people and have antisocial or selfish behavior get an effect. And so this really could contribute to pathways of getting partial feedback, not necessarily social value feedback, but agency feedback. And so this raises questions about what about the opportunities for pro-social learning? If it is really formative in this time, and this idea that learning to care, that the onset of adolescence is a time of burgeoning capacities, motives, and opportunities for learning to care about and contribute meaningfully to the benefit of others, and helping to support healthy versions of this is win-win-win. Feeling like you matter by contributing, getting that feedback in this window of time it really feels like a very large and important set of opportunities. And so this leads to some interesting questions. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this line of thinking. And that is that learning to care and connect emotionally with other people is clearly a core set of issues in adolescence. and the degree to which that develops affective appraisals that influence motivational priorities, just like these other systems that create motives, leads to a question about intrinsic prosocial motivation. And I bet you all know some people or have some examples of just really high prosocial people. They are just naturally giving, generous, and like helping people. And they seem to really enjoy it. And there's some really dramatic versions of people who seem, by all measures, be intrinsically motivated to be very generous and giving. And it's interesting to reflect on those processes at a few different levels. I'm going to go briefly over this now. But the idea that I want to introduce is that feelings of caring and emotional connection are associated with intrinsic motivation. Many people feel intrinsically motivated to support and care about people they have relationships with, their family members, the people that they care about. But the question is, it's an interesting question. Could there be a causal relationship between feelings of caring and having a more intrinsically rewarding experience of caring for and supporting other people? And so I want to take a simple example. Let's consider not how you feel about the relationships you've grown up with and family and close friends, but think about the formation of a new relationship and think about two young adolescents who are exploring the earliest stages of mutual attraction. Where they simply develop this innocent infatuation, crush on each other. It activates some pretty strong feelings. I bet a lot of you can remember your first crush in that period of time and how intense those feelings can be, especially if they're reciprocated. And when we start to care strongly, not only does it activate feelings, they become more salient. Salience is the processing that leaps out. We're more likely to notice them. We're more likely to pay attention to them. We're more likely to respond to them. We're more likely to prioritize them. It is a shift in our prioritization when someone becomes salient. And it's pretty natural that feelings of caring can motivate caring about their feelings. We want them to be happy. And it's not extrinsically motivated, I hope, for most people in those feelings. When you feel strong activation of these caring feelings, it almost feels natural to be kind, generous, and supportive because we've developed strong feelings of caring. It still may be effortful, and we'll talk about that, but it's more likely to be intrinsically rewarding. Humans have a remarkable capacity for developing emotional connections and deeply caring relationships in myriad ways across the entire lifespan, absolutely. But in our species, there's two developmental windows where it really looks like these neural systems naturally turn up the amplitude for motivation related to relational learning. Infants is the first one. And that's a whole interesting story. How much the agency of infants to engage, to find faces, to respond contingently to someone interacting with them, and across infancy. This is really a powerful time of being motivated to bond and create relationship. And the second is, as adolescents are moving into this next phase of their life, they're learning to form emotional connections with close friends and exploring more complex relationships and mature relationships outside the family. And I think there's a lot of evidence that the brain almost expects and is prepared for this kind of learning and has natural motivations that are increasing, which creates a window of opportunity for learning to care and to contribute. And so this, again, without going into the weeds at the moment in terms of the neuroscience, I think there's really a lot of converging evidence that these complex systems of developing neural networks that prioritize motivationally salient social and relational learning contribute to this feeling-based valuing system, learning about self and other, not only in the early brain development, but as puberty initiates a second period of capacities to form intense social bonds and caring and contributing in new ways. And this really has important implications. The neuroscience details aren't that important. They actually give traction to some really interesting neuroscientific advances that can give us more insights. But I think they really come back to the kinds of learning that are most important. Which leads us to guess the motive case 4. Okay, so a guitar 2/3 of a mile long, made out of 7,000 cypress and eucalyptus trees, planted more than 40 years ago. In the Argentine office, and Pedro Martin Ureta, I think he's like in his late 70s now. Couple things. What motivated him to do this and keep these trees alive for 40 years? Certainly not money or fame, and very few people knew about this. He's never seen it. He's afraid to fly. It looks like that to him. Look behind him. Okay, that's what he thinks. Okay? All right. What in the world? Lifetime work. Guesses? I'll let you read it. So it's interesting from a motivational perspective because, in fact, he didn't start it right away. Nothing impulsive. He spent years thinking about it, and has clearly devoted incredible amounts of effort, planning, perseverance, and it's clearly a motivation rooted in strong feelings that are both incredibly positive feelings and some really negative feelings. And it's, again, another slice into these really powerful questions about how feelings connect with our goals, connect with our plans, connect with our resilience and perseverance in positive ways that don't require using grit or executive function to override what we want to do, actually energize what we want to do. And if we can understand how learning shapes these connections between strong feelings or the capacity for strong feelings, it could have incredible insight, relevant. It really could have a lot of relevance. This is a very old quote for me as well as for Aristotle. And I love this. I have many of these quotes, but it's one of my favorites. Is even from a philosophical perspective, centuries ago, that thought by itself moves nothing. Without feelings of desire, the human capacity for rational thought would lack any power to act. Actually, the Greek Alexis gets complicated, but it is so clearly understanding the same concept of these connections of this motivational feeling pull and how important it is, even for someone who thinks that thought is the highest value. So now we're going to come back to learning to contribute as the last frame in this space. Whoops, I'm getting to jump. So adolescence creates these new capacities and motivations for contributing in small and large ways. And these are actions that benefit others at a community or societal level. And discovering ways of gaining these desirable feelings mattering through socially valued contributions in whatever ways are personally meaningful. And personal is really important here. Personal salience. It has to feel real and authentic to the individual. And I'm going to go over this part of it quickly because there's some beautiful papers. Many authors have been identifying adolescents' need and desire to contribute during adolescence. Andrew Fellini has a beautiful paper in Perspective on Psychological Science reviewing this. He also has a paper showing that it's a source of amplifying inequalities because the most disadvantaged kids growing up in more disadvantaged environments have fewer opportunities to contribute in valued ways and fewer supports scaffolds for making those kinds of valued pro-social contributions. And Evelyn Crone and Andrew wrote a beautiful paper about the development of self and others with a big focus on the importance of contribution in this. And this is a really important body of work, but I won't try to summarize it here except to say there's strong evidence that the desire and need to contribute is fundamental to adolescence and fits in really nicely with this model. It's not in no way do those models compete that the need to contribute. It's a version of pro-social learning that's important. But I want to end with one other set of insights, and it seems like a bit of a tangent, but I think it's important. And when I showed you the slide about pivotal time in the life, human life force, see these are some data from anthropologists who have studied food gathering and food sharing in pre-industrial societies. So think of a hunter-gatherer society. And what we're going to show is on this axis is age, and this is net calorie production beyond what you eat. That is, how much food do you bring in to your group? And these are hunter-gatherer groups, so you're bringing in and sharing your food versus how much you personally eat. And you can see, obviously, that infants are negative because they're not, they're just consuming. But if I had asked you before this, when the peak is, it is surprisingly late, 50. Okay, that's late. You think, oh, they didn't last. People didn't. Why? Because the expertise to kill animals with a spear or a blow dart or chasing it down. I mean, the skills. Adolescents are horribly awkward. There's no way they are going to do this. And extractive foraging, digging out tubers and pulverizing them, and sometimes you have to chew it to get amylase. Extractive foraging has incredible expertise and a learning curve that takes a long time. And for 200,000 years, extractive foraging and hunting were really challenging. And the expertise means that it wasn't until 30 to 50 that you're peaking in what you're contributing versus what you are eating. But here's the interesting thing. We say helpless for the first 5 years. Look at adolescents, okay? They are way down here. Why? They're doing some positive things, but they're eating 3 times as much. Anyone have been in the house of adolescent kids? The refrigerator is empty again and again. They are eating like crazy. This is the intergenerational transfer. We couldn't have survived as a species without this. We think this is modern, that we're still like taking care of them in adolescence, and they're not pulling their weight. This has been the part of human history. If they weren't motivated to contribute, what would have happened? What if you just left? What if you the motivation to contribute here and finding ways to contribute had to be enormous to have all of this surplus be given back to the adolescents who are still growing and developing. And so this evidence, and this was the old 2002 paper, but there's been a lot more, David. There's a nice review in 2020 that this is true broadly for humans everywhere, not only in industrialized economies where schooling and apprenticeship can last for years or decades. In contemporary hunter-gatherers, it's still true, representing the best analog. And peak productivity in hunting and extractive foraging in the 30s and 40s and beyond, because it takes so much proficiency. This raises the stakes that in adolescence, individuals should be motivated to learn and develop ways to contribute to others, not only to kin, but to tribe and community. This had to have been important for probably hundreds of thousands of years. We didn't have a motive. We didn't have a species level motive the same way that the sea squirts have a motive to be sensitive to light and bacteria levels. There are motives that are species level that can be expressed in flexible ways. But if it is to find a way to contribute, because that was required for our species, it has really important implications. Oops, this skipped too. So this is basically this developmental window for learning how to contribute in socially valued ways, mastering skills and knowledge to gain social value. This was probably important not only for evolutionary shaping of motivation and learning, but also cultural innovation. Who are the innovators? It's young people. Even if most of them try to emulate the ways that people have been successful in their group, there's a subset that want to do it differently. They want to challenge. They want to be different. We want to fit in, but we want to stand out. And so this creates innovation. If you find a productive way to contribute, if you innovate in some way, you bring it back to your group, you gain social value, it's win-win-win. Cultural innovation can happen by local groups figuring out new ways to do things with food, with developing tools. And so adolescence has probably been fundamental to so many aspects of how human diversity has progressed quickly by having this flexible extended period, not just for social learning and learning how to do skills and hunt, but to innovate and find creative ways to contribute value to the group. So I will bring this together briefly to try to come back to what we were saying, that, humans display quite a remarkable capacity for quite opposite motivational extremes. And this has been true for a very long period of history. On one hand, there's been incredibly inspiring evidence of human capacity to be generous and kind and cooperation in so many ways and scales. And obviously, there's a tremendous amount of evidence that humans can be truly frightening in their capacity for selfish hoarding, brutal striving for status and power, incessant wars, subjugation of people that are weaker, and growing threats of destroying each other and our planet. And I think that it raises some questions about this dual nature or dueling nature. What underpins this fundamentally dual or dueling nature of motivation in our species? These are individual differences. We all know individuals are very different in their proclivities to be pro-social or antisocial. Cultural differences, tremendous cultural differences in terms of how young people get messages about being aggressive, selfish, bold, or pro-social, but also capacities within us. How much of the great literature and movies are about the surprises in each direction? The character you thought so dark, shifting surprisingly to doing something generous, or vice versa. This capacity isn't just how it's shaped developmentally, but I think that is really the most compelling question for the science that I'm involved in, but also this flexible capacity in situations to operate across these extremes. But I think the developmental science questions that are most inspirational to personally for me and some of the groups I'm working with there, to think about the developmental and learning processes and windows of opportunity that are something akin to the pubertal growth spurt that we talked about at the beginning. What is the process that creates vulnerability, but also opportunity, and can be modified, not to make someone completely pro-social or completely antisocial, but to modify the balance? And what are some of the policy questions? Well, it really depends on what we really care about, as well as how to modify these. But I think one really potential, and early development is absolutely probably the most important, like the first few years for all kinds of reasons. And there are other windows of time, like the school transition. There's really brilliant work on pro-social development that has giving us hints about windows of opportunity. But even acknowledging all of these other windows that could be even more important or equally important, I think there's a really compelling case that one potentially pivotal window for formative social learning in relation to this balance is helping young adolescents discover and feel recognized for contributing and caring in ways that are personally and culturally meaningful to them. And these experiences can feel so deeply rewarding in synergistic ways. It's activating those salient feelings of mattering. It's providing positive feedback that their actions can benefit others. And through positive pro-social reputational effects, feeling appreciated for being a caring and contributing person, for contributing something to something larger than self. And having these experiences during that formative early window of identity development in early adolescence could really have a positive impact. And it's not simply being able to be pro-social. Part of social competence is being able to balance the pursuit of our own goals and wants and needs with the caring about the goals, wants, and needs of others. Even a Machiavellian intelligent person needs to understand and incorporate the wants, needs, and goals of others. So much of social competence is really a balance of, yes, we are going to be competitive in many situations. I mean, we're at Duke with UNC down the road. I mean, there's like natural competition that can fuel really positive things, but and in sports. But I think even with natural motivational proclivities to compete for aspects of status and resources, the ability to balance that is a fundamental part of social competence. And I think the developmental transition from childhood into adolescence is a compelling target for more integrative and actual understanding of learning and development interactions and creating windows of opportunity for social and relational learning. And I don't know why this goes so fast. Oh, now we can't. I just have 2 more slides.
Current slide.
Thank you. I think there's some really interesting implications of this work in terms of interventions as experiments to test features of this model, to take more deeply some of these actual insights about these developmental changes at the level. It's not about the neuroscience, it's about how we can model learning as shifts in these motivational systems and the feedback loops across these different systems, and how social, societal, and technological contexts can support and scaffold formative learning during this period, or in many ways can undermine these processes. And I'll try to touch it really lightly. And I think the policy implications are really about investing in these developmental windows of opportunity to provide these positive experiences. And this idea that social competence, the successful pursuit of learning how to manage one's own needs, wants, and goals, balanced with caring about others' goals, wants, and goals, will have a positive impact on multiple outcomes. Education, health, social work, and social success. And then finally, the really last slide is, I think it's very important to take a global perspective. We have more adolescents in the world than have ever existed, and a higher proportion of the world's population is adolescent than ever happened. We have about 1.2 billion adolescents who will be coming of age in the next 10 years. 90% of them are in low and middle income countries. They're growing. They're growing up. It's unprecedented global challenges, climate, immigration, wars, conflict, economic challenges, and rapid technological changes impacting their daily lives, and disrupting culture, disrupting the ways of doing things in many, many parts of the world. And they're growing up with increasing access to all the world's information. Access to AI, access to things that could never have been available a short period of time. And we worry about the unintended consequences of technology. And yet, youth have always been the rapid adapters, the innovators, and on one hand, one of the most concerning issues is intensifying competition for limited resources. There are diminishing resources in many, many ways. Fierce competition brings out the worst aspects of our motivation when we feel threatened, and the competition is amplified in the negative extremes of these motivations. But there's no diminishing resources in terms of opportunities for meaningful contribution. There's an abundance of ways to make meaningful contributions to your communities, to your country, to causes, to global problems, to being innovators in creative approaches, and not to put onto young people that that's their responsibility. That would be the opposite. It'd be like telling people what they should or shouldn't do. It is encouraging them to discover ways that their agency and insight and creative approaches and being able to create collective action and use these technologies for good, to admire that, not to be polite or insincere, but because it will be amazing to watch what young people can do to have an impact and earn the prestige they should have. That's a positive feedback loop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dahl. Great talk. We have some time for questions. I know I have a lot of questions. I'm sure you all do too. How about if I start with one and then we open it up to everyone else? So one question, I really like your framing of adolescence is this window of opportunity. And one thing that really resonated with me was the way that you're thinking about all of these positives, right? I think adolescence is so oftentimes framed as a developmental period with high risk taking. I'm wondering if you could give some examples of programs or policies that oftentimes are designed to reduce risky behavior, sort of drug prevention, bullying prevention, and put a spin on it that would focus on the aspects of adolescence you were talking about in terms of learning to care, learning to contribute, and what that might look like in a program or policy with that reframed lens.
Yeah, thank you very much. So there's two levels of answer to that, or approaches to answering that I think are really important. And again, working with a lot of colleagues who are thinking about these issues, and I think it's a very, very important question, but it's not in any way to diminish or mitigate the amplitude of the problem. I again, I've done a lot of work on the front lines of complex problems with youth in many parts of the world. In fact, I think it is not to suggest that a light touch intervention earlier is going to miraculously make these changes. But I think it's why I took a little time to just talk about like the Jaeger and Brian approach, is that it's going to take interdisciplinary teams who really understand the local and cultural context, that understand the principle. One of the most important things that has emerged, I think, and we would talk about this in the paper, but also in a couple of our group meetings, is the difference between a feeling that lands authentically and saying the right thing. And the difference between telling a young person, I really admire that you're doing what I actually thought you should be doing, that sounds like you're trying to control them, manipulate them, and you made that video, you inspired and helped us. Recognizing the contributions and having the response hit authentic feelings sounds like a subtle piece, but it's crucial, because otherwise it's so easy to think you're giving the right message and not having it land that way. So that creates huge challenges, because of how to create personally meaningful, rewarding experiences. So I think co-designing with youth, I think that youth participatory action research that is engaged, having experts with that set of issues and problems. And so one of the things about bullying is if you gain even short-term increased reputational effect, or even feeling of having power that makes you feel better in the short run, that can begin to cascade, as you and others have been writing about and thinking about, or like creating a defensive mindset that any threat, you've got to react quickly. Like how to create learning that can compete with that fast automatic tendency that's already been learned. I think we have some really good insights into how that can happen. I sometimes use an example from psychology. I don't know if this would be good, like the classic Stroop phenomenon, which is that if you are identifying the color of the letters of a word, BLUE at red ink, versus reading the word, people are much faster in reading words than naming colors, and they get an interference effect when you tell them, no, just tell the ink. Why is that? Well, it's not because one is faster than the other. It's that we've read hundreds of thousands of words and we've only named colors tens of thousands of times, so those tracks are faster. If you start with a young kid, they don't have a Stroop effect, because they haven't spent more time reading words than naming colors. You cannot get a Stroop effect. And if you take a kid who's just developing a Stroop effect, you can override the learning pretty quickly, just having them name a lot of colors for a while. And so it's a rough analogy, but I think it's relevant to why times when these neural systems are starting to interact in new ways because of the developmental change, maybe 10 or 50 experiences can really shift the tendency. And I think there's some great and challenging questions about how some kids who've had really traumatizing experiences early, or have had so many negative experiences, social learning experiences, it might be incredibly hard to have new learning that really competes with that, or that strong tendency to have a defensive, aggressive mindset. But I think there are other areas, especially I think that for some of these social and emotional disorders, anxiety, depression, feelings of not being valued, I think there may be easier opportunities. But I think teams who take these insights and take the models may come up with some really innovative ways to authentically increase the success of young people to feel enlarged by a different approach to interactions. And I think those things happen. The other thing that I would say is some of my colleagues who are working in some of these really gnarly problem areas with adolescents and young adults often cite the fact that a relationship can often be what turns it around. And they typically are talking about a romantic relationship. Obviously, that can make things worse, but I think it's also an indication that relational learning is probably more powerful than information-based learning or even cognitive behavioral therapy learning, which doesn't have a relational, because the brain is expecting, like the speed with which you can shift motivations in a relational frame of learning is much faster. And so I think there's some relational approaches. So those are pointing at, but I think the most important thing I would say is we need really innovative, integrative teams who understand different levels, but the front line, like we were talking, like when you try, even after you have a good intervention, implementing it and trying to do it to scale is so challenging that having the right teams of people that try to move from the actionable insights to how do we leverage this in the window with ways that make these authentic feelings that build on relational learning. I think teams can do this. It's not going to be simple. It's not going to be broad, but I think we can target different processes that way.
Thank you very much.
We've got a question from online. Ann Rollins from the Poe Center said, thank you very much for your presentation. And she wanted to know, and you just mentioned this a bit, but how this relates to the incredible rise in youth suicide, particularly among young teens, 10 to 14, and how you see this work sort of relating to that and maybe helping explain or point to places for intervening.
Yeah, really, really gnarly set of issues with suicidality. I've had these conversations with a few colleagues. I think that there's one small but potentially direct answer is that if young people are feeling a lack of being valued and that their actions don't matter, I think that this that could clearly contribute in some ways to risk for not finding life worth living or not having a feeling of that. I think that the suicidality research, especially in early adolescence, is complicated. There's been a lot of people trying to look at the processes that lead to some action-directed belief that they could feel better or less worse in that window of time. But I don't think there's a simple answer that's beyond what we were talking about, in response to the earlier question. Experts who are really on the front lines working with suicidal youth in this age group and having some clinical level intuitions who are now thinking about these kinds of models as leverage points for creating positive learning experiences. I spent 15 years working on treatments for depressed kids and suicidal kids. And one of the things that became really clear is we tended to focus so much on the negative feelings, their sadness, their ruminations, their worry, their, we would do experience sampling and they would go to a party, have a pretty good time, but come home. And the only thing they'd remember is the embarrassing thing. And they would say, oh, it was a terrible experience. So these cognitive distortions, we focus so much on the negative. Often, it's not just behavioral activation. Activating positive experiences can be more impactful. And so, like for the anxiety and worry at bedtime, trying to push those away, we know that doesn't work. Savoring is a skill where you remember uplifting moments from your day or uplifting memories, and you repeat them the way you would do with something you're worried and ruminating about. And when you flip back to your worries, you teach them switching skills to the positive. Those kinds of interventions, activating positive, giving skills for activating positive, having them then enjoy that they can do this at bedtime, doing it during the day, doing it at bedtime. So finding ways to activate positive in early adolescence can often be more effective than just focusing on how do we decrease the negative. But those are very oversimplified. But I do think there are opportunities to use these insights and try to build these positive growth directions for young people that feel meaningful to them.
Let's take one more question here in the room, and then we will have time to linger over the reception in the back. So how about one more question now and then informal conversation?
Hi, this is really a lovely talk. My name is Katie Sellers, and I work in the Religion and Social Change Lab here at Duke. I used to teach high school. And so everything that you're sharing is resonant with my students. And I had this very distinctive experience in my first year teaching where I went from kind of being the teacher everyone rejected to the teacher in the that everyone loved and wouldn't leave my classroom. And it happened over an action civics project that I kind of accidentally stumbled into. And my students got to take control over the classroom essentially for the remainder of the school year. And so as I'm kind of hearing your research and kind of storying it with my own experience, I wonder, are there particular policies related to education or practices that you've seen in educational spaces with adolescents that have been particularly effective in a local or even statewide setting related to action research I heard you allude to, or other practices?
Yeah, so a couple things quickly. And first of all, thanks for doing that. And great story of how you just flip that dynamic and they feel empowered and they have control and then they start doing amazing things and you can support that, which is a whole lot more enjoyable for everybody. So I think two things. In terms of a body of research relevant to those issues, I think David Yeager and his colleagues have done a really elegant work on a number of levels. And I think some of David's work taking these ideas and randomizing schools, I think we're looking at growth mindset, but they were looking at a variety of other things as well. And again, it gets back to this issue of complexity. Like with the growth mindset, if the teachers didn't believe it, then the intervention didn't work very well. And so it's a system. And so, but I think this ability to say, where is it working and for which kids is it working? And how does that give us feedback for designing other interventions and doing this at large scale? Like, he's done a lot of really elegant work, but he's also done studies about meaningfulness of what you're learning that has had an impact. And a lot of what has been influencing his work is, even though these are incredibly relevant in high school, and even like he's done work entering college, like when helping meaning and purpose framing in this space. I think his heart is that in early adolescence may be such there are greater opportunities for these learning experiences to have impact. But I think he's one of the people who's been working with teams and a lot of education experts and looking at systems and randomizing large numbers of schools. But there are many people, I think, who are looking at innovation and education with some of the same lens, but not the same lens. I might ask Emma, who's actually working more with education systems than I am, who's was the author on the paper that I mentioned earlier. So, do you have any comments about other things in education?
Off the top of my head, but I'm happy to say after this.
All right.
Please join me again and thank you. We're really grateful to you for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you all for coming. We hope you'll continue to engage with the Center for Child and Family Policy in future events. We have a lot of exciting programming. And please stay and have some snacks and drinks and mingle and talk informally. Thanks again for coming. Thank you.